From Poitin's unfair weight cut destroying the middleweight division to the controversial use of IV bags for rehydration, here's how the UFC actually allows fighters to cheat. After Alex Pereira's sudden rise to the top of the middleweight division, fans started to raise their eyebrows in confusion. How did an MMA novice like him come to dominate so viciously in such a competitive sport? The answer was always in front of everyone's eyes. Pereira is too massive to fight middleweight fighters. That's why he was able to take them out so easily. He walks around at 233 pounds, which is an unreal size for a middleweight. The qualifying weight in the division is 185, nearly 40 pounds below Pereira's natural weight. So how did the UFC allow this? Well, it's because Alex went through a gruesome weight cut, which started 17 days before the weigh-in. That's a ridiculously long time for a cut, since fighters usually start cutting weight 3 to 4 days before stepping on the scale. For a 40-pound weight cut like Pereira's, it's impossible to do it within a week's time. The weight difference allows him to fight people who are much smaller than him, giving the Brazilian an unfair advantage. One look at the guy and you can figure out he's not a middleweight. He's ripped and towers above most fighters at a height of 6'4", so the fact that Adesanya was able to even beat him is insane. By then, the damage to the division had already been done, and the UFC stood by the whole time. Fighters had gotten into the octagon with Pereira, with the scales literally tipped against them from the beginning, coming back with losses permanently etched in their records. Even everyone's favorite podcaster, Joe Rogan, called it sanctioned cheating. Joe was talking to his guest Steve-O on his podcast when he was asked if Pereira really weighed 220 at the time of the fight. Rogan replied that it's definitely a plausible number, since by the time the fight rolls around, Pereira goes beyond the usual weight for middleweight fighters. If the fight happened the same day as the weigh-in, he'd be too weak to perform like he usually does. While fighters naturally closer to middleweight would be in much better form. In the time between the weigh-in and the fight, fighters can gain back all their lost weight, making the system of weight divisions completely pointless. Rogan called it unfair, believing it's not widely criticized since everyone does it. Joe also discussed how Adesanya was at a severe disadvantage getting in the octagon with the Brazilian. Izzy doesn't cut the same kind of weight that Pereira's cuts, since he's already closer to being a middleweight. In another podcast with Sean O'Malley, Joe and The Sugar Show were discussing Pereira's size. Rogan said that in his books, Pereira is a straight-up heavyweight. Sean was in complete agreement too, saying that even though Izzy is a big guy, Alex still makes him look small. The podcaster speculated that because of the weight cut, Alex's ability to take damage is reduced greatly, leaving his weaker chin to be knocked out by Izzy at UFC 287, which is a concern that gets swept under the rug too often. All I'm saying is, when the UFC allows such a dangerous practice to become common, the fighters put their own health at risk, which could very well have long-lasting consequences. Joe explained that the long periods of dehydration faced in the weight cut are hell for the body. When Alex was fighting in the middleweight division, he'd be expected to constantly cut weight again and again throughout the year, so his body would have been extremely burned out. Weight cuts are already controversial in the promotion, with fighters like Aspen Ladd being kicked out of the UFC for repeatedly failing to make weight. It wasn't for lack of trying though, because Aspen showed up to the UFC Vegas 38 weighing trembling and shaking. Ladd almost collapsed multiple times because of how severely the weight loss affected her body. It was a horrifying sight for fans and showed the pain fighters were going through, which the UFC did nothing to prevent. UFC fighter Jim Miller had his organs permanently damaged from the practice. Miller one day discovered blood in his urine and started feeling a sharp pain in his kidneys, only to later realize that he had kidney stones. But that wasn't the only consequence. Just a year before that, he'd also suffered through a kidney infection. Miller said that it's probably from constantly having to cut weight, and won't be surprised if it takes a few years off of his lifespan. In a sport where health and conditioning is the most important asset, expecting excessive weight cuts from fighters is extremely dangerous for their careers. So you must be thinking, why does the UFC allow it in the first place? Well, it's because fighters drastically changing weight is insanely profitable for them. When icons as legendary as Conor McGregor can fight in 3 different divisions, why'd they ever stop it? Even though Conor looked like a ghost fighting at featherweight, the promotion didn't care because the UFC got its first double champ. Fighters reaching a new height of glory gives them the power to fill more seats in the stadium, and Dana White goes to bed a happier man. One of the UFC's wildest exploits also came from Pereira's fights. When Alex debuted in the organization, it felt like the UFC brought him in only to sick him on Adesanya, who seemed invincible as the middleweight champion. Due to their past kickboxing rivalry, this was one of the greatest storylines the middleweight division had ever seen. But after Pereira lost at UFC 287, the story found its natural conclusion. Dana White immediately decided it would be better if Pereira moved up to light heavyweight because making 185 pounds was getting riskier with every fight. The organization suspiciously wasn't concerned at all when the rivalry was still active, but they only considered the weight cut too excessive afterward. After Khamzat Chimaev missed weight on the main card for UFC 279, causing a huge upset for the UFC, Dana wasn't going to take any chances with another big-name fighter like Pereira taking a difficult weight cut. It's not the first time the UFC has turned a blind eye towards fighters cheating either, because Daniel Cormier cheated and faced no consequences whatsoever. Back when the Hall of Famer had to fight Anthony Johnson at UFC 210, DC stood on the scale missing weight the first time around. But a few seconds later, after taking off his clothes and standing behind a towel, he'd somehow magically made weight within a few seconds. Obviously, this should have been cause for concern, but the UFC was too busy being happy knowing the fight was still on. Cormier himself later revealed he cheated by grabbing the towel for support, distributing his weight and qualifying him for the fight. After Cormier won, Anthony added a permanent loss to his record that he never should have had to. Dustin Poirier has also been a vocal victim of cheating, but the UFC didn't seem to care one bit. Back in his trilogy fight against McGregor at UFC 264, Poirier accused the Irishman of cheating in the first round. Apparently, Conor was stuffing his fingers inside Dustin's gloves, pulling him into his upkicks. That's why Poirier let McGregor get up, since referee Herb Dean wasn't stopping it, even though it is an illegal move. Conor didn't deny doing it either, but Dana being his #1 fan meant that he was getting off scot-free. With MMA already considered barbaric by the mainstream, if the UFC continues to ignore cheating, the whole industry might suffer because of it. After Adesanya tweeted about fighters using IV bags to rehydrate after weighing in, it became harder for the UFC to deny allowing fighters to cheat. Adesanya demanded that fighters need to be monitored from weigh-in to fight day by USADA, because if giants like Pereira can go back to their usual size by the time of the fight, why even cut weight in the first place? It just meant Adesanya would be fighting way above his weight class, and the UFC would happily put it on their main card, sending him into a losing battle. After a resounding response over the internet, saying the issue was probably going to be sidelined, Adesanya lost hope and tweeted that if you can't beat them, you might as well join them. If one of the top fighters in the league can't do anything about it, the UFC is probably crossing their fingers every time they say the words fair fight. So there you have it. From the controversial use of IV bags for rehydration before getting into the octagon, to Pereira's brutally unfair weight cut, destroying the middleweight division, that was all about why the UFC actually allows fighters to cheat.